Hi everyone, I'm Gayatri Gopinath. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at NYU. And it's my great pleasure to be in conversation with Julie Mehretu and Shahzia Sikander. And I thought we'd begin by talking about your shared history, because many people watching may not actually know that you both have a long-standing relation to each other, dating back something like 25 years. So I believe, Julie, you were 2 years behind Shahzia at RISD. Then you both were at Houston on a residency. You worked with Project Row Houses, which is a community arts organization in Houston. And then Shahzia, you curated Julie's work at Exit Art in 1999. And I believe, Julie, that was the first time your work was shown in New York. So maybe we can simply begin by talking about that history and then what that long-standing relation has sort of meant to you both.
Please.
Julie, do you remember?
I remember very well. So I took a train from the city to Providence because I was touring RISD as a prospective student for graduate studies. And Shahzia was the one who met me at the train station to give me a tour. And I had never, and immediately I was so taken by you. And you told me so much about the school, but gave me a full tour, and you were you're like completely mesmerizing and fascinating as an individual. And I was like, who's this amazing woman? It's like, knows all these kids who are here, came here from Lahore, is like completely like invented this different world here. And you were so exuberant about the school and about Michael Young and Donna and Marianne and the many different people, but also students who were there, and was very convincing about the program. I was really thinking about another school as well, and you really convinced me to go there, but then also just stayed in touch. It was a very organic and generous and welcoming kind of dynamic, and I hadn't really experienced that a lot, really, because and that was something, and then we stayed in touch. Shahzia left RISD and went to Houston, and then when I applied to the core program, and when I got in, I called you, or wrote you. I think I called you because we didn't have ways to write each other then.
Yeah.
And then you connected me with Rick Lowe. You said, if you come to Houston, you have to meet Rick. And that's how I got involved in Project Row Houses, and we stayed in touch.
Yeah. Oh God.
Yeah. Do you remember?
Of course I remember. I remember. It was one of my many jobs at RISD at that time. Was also to sort of recruit new students. And then we knew some other people, right?
You were working under the ambassadorship.
But it was, I have that same sort of, it was, a very organic, immediate, just a very beautiful connection. And Julie was just mesmerizing too. And Julie knew many people. You already knew another couple of Pakistani people, like you knew somebody from London that I knew. So already.
Yeah, but that was after I was at RISD.
Oh, was it?
Because they were there at that school.
No. This is somebody else, and I remember like it was already like the connections were present. They were like there was all of this was pregnant in that moment, that this was going to yield.
Yeah.
More than just like meeting somebody and meeting someone at school, because one met so many people. But even over the last so many years, it's not like we've kept always in touch. But whenever we pick up, it's always there.
One of the reasons I wanted folks to know about this is because know about your shared history. Is because, of the ways in which collaboration has been really central to both of your practices, and particularly collaboration with other artists of color. And, Shahzia, you've spoken about how particularly working with African American, Black diasporic artists has been really formative to you, right? At RISD and then ongoing in Houston as well. And so to me, thinking about both of you together is really about understanding your capacious sense of South Asianness that you sort of embody in both your life and your work has been deeply inflected by Blackness. You know, it's been deeply informed by Blackness. And I think that gets really written out of sort of South Asian diasporic art histories, you know? And then Julie, for you, you know, your longstanding collaborations with other artists of color also speaks to a kind of capacious sense of Blackness that's really about overlapping diasporas, you know, to use a phrase that Shahzia, you use for your own work. So that's why I kind of wanted to highlight that. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that, or, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the really exciting aspects about meeting Shahzia and her engagement at RISD was not only the kind of possibility that her work opened in contemporary art in terms of what she could do with this language. And this was a moment that the whole world was shifting towards this kind of, at least the art world in New York, towards this internationalist kind of globalized perspective on looking at work. And many women were in the middle, were at the forefront of that. You got Amer from Egypt. You had this very kind of like, I remember going to these shows in Chelsea and Soho being kind of completely surprised with Ellen Gallagher at Mary Boone. And I remember seeing your work. I remember seeing Gada at Anina Nose, and there was this kind of really this beginning. It was really the beginning of a kind of internationalist vision on or participation in what was included in the conversation.
Right.
And before that, it was really much more focused on the city and mostly white artists and emerging from the city. So that shifted the conversation. And the early 90s brought that to the fore, I think, in the city. But the mid-90s and the end of the 90s really pushed this in a different way. So that was super exciting to see that engagement. But then what Shahzia's work always did through this relationship through your work with Project Row Houses, but what you just mentioned, I think, was really kind of also super interesting to have that other aspect of Blackness layered into the conversation. And for me, I think what ended up becoming really formative was I look at a lot of different work, and so working with ink and working with India ink and Sumi ink, these kind of really, you know, different form of both East and West Asian traditions of materiality and mark making were kind of really formative to the way that I think about mark making. And you know, when you talk about different kind of layered diasporic languages, visually those were forms of language that became very intuitively part of the way that I worked. And I think I see relationships between not just the two of us, but also going back to Kara as well. Kara Walker, who's another student at the school at the time. So there's this kind of really interesting emergence of those kind of layered languages, visual languages in our work, as well as these kind of different diasporic discourses that were kind of informing one another.
Absolutely.
I think that was a very important moment in the US in the 90s. There was a sense of an outward kind of poised, right? Like there's an interest in what was happening, which I just want to point out that I felt went very inward post 9/11. So this sort of what we're identifying as this kind of interest in the other, but from like a more intimate space, where I felt like I could really, I kind of went to New York from Houston on one visit with my roommate, Nicola Costantino, and both of us, we had a very interesting visit to the city. She got into a show at Exit Art. I shared my work with Annie Philbin, and I was in the drawing center. So like it was just, everything was so porous and open and possible. And then a few years later, you know, it's a very different art world. It's a very different kind of culture around the art world also. And that definitely is something that, you know, is present in the work. But when I think of it, like, how did that moment sort of got lost in some ways? Because America is a very black and white culture. And still, so, you know, it still is, and it's always been. And so as a sort of, for me, coming the way I did, especially in Houston at that time when there's so many kind of, it's racially fairly segregated, and deep-rooted segregation is very prevalent in the U.S. too, and how one is being perceived versus what one is bringing. Like I'm coming from a very kind of Pakistan, growing up there. It's already very multivalent and multicultural, and then you're bringing all of that, but here, the perception could be much more in perspective to the wars that were unfolding, like this, you got pigeonholed into this idea of like the Muslim woman, and even what that meant, how that identity was performed in other people's histories and their knowledge, and especially, in terms of like a lot of U.S. foreign policy and women, how sort of, and then of course I lived in Somalia, so there's that layer also in sort of how I'm navigating, like who's my audience, and engaging with African American language and music and vernacular and storytelling and histories and political histories. Like when you're driving, like when I drove from north to south and stopping into all these areas, like you're aware that America's sort of past ghosts and America's history of American foreign policy is connected to its sort of history and slavery and genocide and all of that. Like, and that war was unfolding in northern Pakistan, in Afghanistan, growing up in the 80s. So it's kind of the parallel is running. So you can't divorce that from like a kind of, okay, all of this is percolating.
Right, sure.
So it's not just like you're just the outsider.
Right.
You're already familiar with America. Yeah. America has a presence outside of the U.S. that people know America at a very intimate level.
Well, that's what really struck me, again, thinking about both of you in relation, is that you're both formed by these diasporic histories that are about war and revolution and Cold War militarism, especially in relation to Pakistan, right? And that's sort of that's what precipitates your presence here in the U.S., right? In a lot of ways, that's what produced you and that informs your work. And Shahzia, you've talked about how, having growing up or spending some time in Somalia as a young person, it gave you already a kind of internationalist sense of blackness and an international sense of Islam, right? That then you sort of brought here.
Yeah, and like growing up with in Pakistan with grandparents, I was aware, Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, what they represented was understood in a very clear manner. Yeah. So I was also curious about that idea of Black power and its overlaps in Europe and in an international, even in its intellectual drive. Yeah. How that aspect as a South Asian,
right?
Especially with histories of South Asians in Uganda and
absolutely
what that kind of very complex history of South Asian. Right. Being within Africa and outside of Africa, like those are discussions which have been present in immediate family.
Yeah,
also
absolutely.
And they've been such like the entire decolonized the decades of decolonialism. Like when you were thinking of the post-colonial moment, whether it was on the African continent or through Southeast Asia, through all of this was happening at a similar time. And so these gestures were the kind of Pan-African gestures, the kind of discourse between Pan-Africanism and what was happening. When I was just recently in Dhaka, and I was really making sense of what happened post-partition and what happened in kind of revolutionary moments there, were so in sync with what was happening on the continent. This kind of internationalist discourse was happening in the 60s, in the 70s. And so it's, of course, it's no wonder that Malcolm X was formative in that discourse. I also think what you were talking about with American internationalist kind of optimism, which came to a kind of crashing halt right at 9/11 and post 9/11, and then the kind of rise, intense kind of rise of Islamophobia that just took over this country. But you know, the art world always tried to keep a perspective on that, and it's really interesting how much the art world also responded in that way, I think. And other places of discourse, I think you can see it in the academia, you see it in different places where even like what you're talking about, the kind of reflection of American foreign policy and American kind of internationalist engagement informs how we engage here and how that discourse takes place here. Even if you think of the academic and art worlds and journalistic worlds as being somewhat more leftist or somewhat more liberal in their understanding of things, it's really kind of interesting how much that internationalist engagement, even in the art world, closed up. And I've been thinking always about it through Okuyo Enzor's kind of engagement with like the internationalist exhibitions that happened also post the late 90s, early 2000s, and how that was the art world I grew up in, and that was the art world you brought me into when you first showed my work in New York, and it was a super different, optimistic kind of engagement that we're talking about, and it is interesting how much that has kind of shrunk, in a way.
It totally shrunk. Like for an artist like myself, that kind of embracement, so sort of in the art world, for example, in the late 90s, I remember like post 9/11. It was hard to find space for my work. I felt like the focus was so national-based silos. So if you and simultaneously, I had people tell me, "Oh, return to Pakistan, because if you don't, Pakistan is going to be global, and you will not be part of that story." So interesting, no? How you do see that inwardness that's happening, and then obviously capital and power is diversifying and shifting, and it was always there, it's just perhaps the lens has shifted, and then nation-based ideas. So either you had to be really deeply entrenched in the diaspora, or you were the kind of from the authentic place of the nation, or whatever that meant, right? So I think I remember that those conversations of the local global become a pretty polarizing also. And
I mean, this sort of gets me into sort of the next thing I wanted to talk to you both about, which is the concept of intimacy and the way in which, you know, that actually becomes a useful way of thinking about both your work. And so the way in which I'm understanding intimacy is from the work of a scholar like Lisa Lowe, who's written a book called The Intimacy of Four Continents, where she talks about the ties that bind Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas together through these, you know, violent histories of colonialism, slavery, indentureship, global capital. And, you know, what both of you have been articulating is how those same sort of violent histories have also produced these South-South connections, you know, of Malcolm X and, you know, these kind of revolutionary nationalisms that, as Julie's work so clearly shows, has both such promise and failure in this moment, you know. But so intimacy, you know, the way I understand it, following somebody like Lisa Lowe, is about the overlapping of what seem to be these really discrete locations, you know, the ways in which they actually are intimately connected. And so, Julie, I think your work, you know, in the kind of palimpsestic landscapes you create, is very much producing the kind of intimacy of all these different sites, right? That we don't think of as connected, you know. So that's one way in which intimacy works conceptually, and we can talk about how it works formally. But then, Shahzia, you know, intimacy, I think, is something that threads throughout all the work here. So in 2001, you did a painting named Intimacy, right? That depicted this Bronzino's Venus, right, from the 16th century, in relation to this Indian Devata figure from the 11th century, right? And then you see those two figures, these iconic feminine figures, replicated in the sculpture that you just did in 2020, right? 20 years later. So you know, I wrote a piece on your work entitled Promiscuous Intimacies that was where I used that phrase to reference the ways in which you intertwine these different art historical traditions. So that's another way in which intimacy is sort of operating as a concept in your work. But then there's also the sexual and the erotic element of intimacy that comes out very clearly in the sculpture. So do you want to maybe, either if you want to say more, maybe just reflect on what if that concept resonates for you and in what ways?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting kind of way. I actually haven't read Lisa Lowe's work, and I'd like to. Lisa Lowe, right? And I would like to, but yeah, I think that's this idea of this kind of these kind of constructed intimacies, or I don't know, these kind of trapezoidal, what do you want to call them, kind of dramatic kind of like dynamics that engage with one another. You create these kind of cultural kind of really interesting kind of intimacies, to me, are so formative in terms of who we are. And I don't, there's no, it was again, going back to Dhaka and experiencing Dhaka and feeling so familiar from narratives of Addis Ababa or narratives of other places on the continent and other places that I've studied. So, and remembering the kind of conversation, remembering even though some of those images, some of the kind of revolutionary posters and the kind of that form of discourse. That was something that was completely unexpected and so interesting to pick up on and to feel that familiarity. But I also think when you think of something I hadn't thought about, but with the question that you bring up, I think in my work, you have these very detailed moments inside of them, and the only way to engage with these really large paintings is by actually getting up close and getting very intimate and engaged in this kind of other narrative that's happening. And there aren't really cultural identifiers in the mark making. It's the kind of, it becomes this other space, and that's this intentional decision that one can't necessarily define by our cultural codes. They become and start to generate their own signifiers and it becomes its own language in this way. And yet it's engaging within these social constructs of this architecture that is this shared language, but is specific to culture and specific to place, time, and so kind of social political space. And so, yeah, I think that's a super interesting kind of lens and way to think about it. But I don't know Lisa's work.
Yeah, no, but you know what you just said about how you know, intimacy also works on that formal level where, as a spectator, at least as a viewer, you're forced into this kind of intimate relation to your work, both of you, because of its precision and its detail and its, you know, and the fine quality of it. And so, you know, thinking about your work, Julie, and the question we'll talk about in a second around monumentality, you know, the work demands that really close attention, right? Yeah. It demands a kind of intimacy from the viewer, even as, you know, you also have to pull out. Right.
And that's the same with the miniatures. Exactly. I mean, the kind of, even more exacting and more demanding. And what amazes me is the kind of world building that happens in these works that emerge from a historic sense of that world building, but this kind of new cosmological kind of world building that has been core to, I think, non-European or not, you know, this kind of things that I'm thinking about a lot recently in terms of ways of building knowledge and accumulating knowledge that come from a perspective where things are not kind of in the European modernist tradition. Things are so kind of categorized and reduced to these particular areas of study, and this happens in the academia, it happens in the art world, but either architecture or astronomy, that those things aren't engaged with one another in the way that they used to be in many kind of earlier practices. And I think that's something that I was thinking about a lot just looking at the show right now, about these really intimate but very kind of massive, the scale is massive in
Yeah.
terms of where that world building goes, you know, and
Right.
I think it would be great to hear you talk
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, definitely. Even when I look at the historical works and go into the archives and look at older paintings, they always embody so much more than the portraiture or a moment in time or the descriptive text that usually, you know, accompanies or the provenance of that object. So I always thought that there's much more at the borders, you know, at the buzzing with information, and that they imply that there's a wider, broader, sort of a much more heroic
Yeah.
sense of representation and not just space, and they're bold in that way and intelligent, and you know, so that's how, when I'm perusing and doing research, that's how I see that work speak back, and that's always been, you know, kind of a wonderful thing to keep in mind, that you're engaging with this incredible, detailed way of expression, and then how do you keep it open-ended? How do you insert time?
Yeah.
How do you insert like space and time
Right.
without just making it like just kind of become like an illustration of a moment? How do you make it timeless?
Right.
And
It's so, you know, just to think back to that 2001 painting, you know, Intimacy, just can you talk a little bit about how that concept, why that concept was meaningful for you? And how you, because it's the same figures that you're tracing, you know, over and over again, you know, that then emerge in the sculpture.
Yeah.
So what is it about what is it about that sort of connection that was interesting to you?
I remember when I sketched that relationship, I was, you know, I was burdened with this, like being almost made, like I was representing like myself, and I was like, my work is not representing I'm not really performing my identity, but I'm equally curious in determining what that, where are some of the deeper representations emerging from, like what is the representation of Islam in West's imagination. Those are deep-rooted silos, and usually, and that's, if you look at how even like the history of Islamic art, who gets to write it? If you look at representation of manuscript painting, it's a very Eurocentric discourse for a while and for some time, and how do you, and then that has its own colonial legacy, and growing up in Pakistan, when you're encountering it, you have to really understand that its history is what its representation is. So once I started to sort of navigate that, then it was more about how do you engage with the archetypes? What are these representations? How do you dig deeper and place them differently in history? Because I refuse to believe that there was only influence from the West that was informing the artisans and artists in India. There was a cross-cultural influence happening all the time,
Right.
And then we were always fed that, you know, it was only one-sided, and so it was also kind of this whole how to break that aspect down. So once I started to think of that, then I thought, okay, you know, women and women's histories and women's representation is often the one that gets diffused or co-opted or erased, and then where are the protagonists that I'm driven drive me. And that's when even taking up like tropes of Radha Krishna, you know, I was like, okay, right here, if I'm understanding Radha as an agency that is not necessarily dependent on Krishna, it's a kind of, there are multiple ways to see it. So I was like, let's exit Krishna for a while and play with Radha's ability to uproot it, and how does it become an apparatus of power. And when you start doing that, it's like, it's a kind of, it's not because, you know, because of just being South Asian. It's also about who's been writing about Radha Krishna, often a very European scholarship. And then in the same way, like, you know, kind of engaging with protagonists that are, that we all share. Like I was studying Renaissance art in Pakistan. I was, you know, we cannot just say that that's theirs and this is ours, in the same way that I don't say that, you know, this manuscript painting is like Pakistani nationalistic art. It's geographically so vast, historically so vast, and over so much time, like who gets to own what? Who gets to claim what? But definitely as a collective space in terms of women's representation, that was like, oh, this is incredible. Like, this needs to be seen from as many ways as possible, because no matter what lens I'm going to put on it, it's going to be challenging.
Right.
And that's sort of the premise for that. And also looking at, you know, Eurocentric art history. So the notion of the other was always much more centralized. So that's why I was like, okay, let's just bring Venus in conversation with the Devata. But the Devata already at the Met is a problematic provenance.
Of course.
You know, it's
because it's a history of
colonial baggage. It's like temple sculpture.
Right.
You know, and so when you come to it, the already sculpture is sort of, you know, the limbs were missing. So how do you engage with that? So for me, doing the sculpture was really just kind of re-energizing that moment and being like, okay, let me pull this out and like work with live models and see if it's even legible, this idea that I had, and then see what happens. And the dynamic is completely different, because then is the Devata is she being uplifted, or is she actually weighing down the Venus? How do they wrap? How are their bodies, you know, engaged? What is the body language? Are they actually, when you look at them, they're not looking into each other's eyes either. Right. But you can't tell. But then you think, but when you keep looking, it looks as if the Venus is wanting the Devata to look at her. But her gaze is a little bit
desire
off.
is going
but
one way.
All of these things, so like all of these things could not be activated in that sketch.
Got it.
So I feel like in that way, you know, it's very much like art history. It's cyclical, all of how the culture and the participants and the languages, as they shift and change, we're able to decolonize, we're able to deconstruct so many things and kind of reposition ourselves in relationship to history in different ways.
I mean, it seems to me that both of you are really pushing against, I mean, you were saying this earlier, Julie, you know, pushing against these kind of siloed ways in which knowledge production happens, you know, whether it's in the academy or elsewhere, right, or in the art world. So really pushing against this kind of area studies knowledge that gets so sedimented around, you know, this is South Asia, this is Africa, etc., right? As well as what you were saying in terms of disciplines. And I see both of your work really sort of exploding that. So I do want to talk about the question of queerness. I wrote a piece on that put both of you in conversation that was called Queer Infinities. And there's actually going to be a symposium, I believe, at the Whitney called Queer Black Abstraction, right? In relation to your work, Julie, at the end of the month. So clearly people are thinking in these terms, in relation to your work. And so for me, thinking about queerness in relation to both of your works, it becomes a way into linking it. And my understanding of the term is first around, questions of gender and sexual non-normativity, but also, about a different kind of looking that the work enables, right? Which I would call a kind of queer optic that allows the intimacies of these different landscapes, geographies, histories to come into view. So, what I see both of you doing in your work is instantiating a different way of looking that I would call a kind of queer gaze. But so, Shahzia, let's sort of start with you, because I think, it's kind of been under-theorized in your work, but, gender and sexual non-normativity is actually a through line, from your earliest work to the sculpture. So I was wondering if you could sort of talk about how you see that at play in your own work.
I feel like the South Asian identity, if I just zoom out, the South Asian identity itself has so much play of how the intimacy functions in inside and outside of lived sort of public-private spaces, in terms of even language, poetry, literature, film. Like all these representations are just so full. And they never, but overarching has always been this kind of the official labels are almost always very binary. But then I even looking at the visuals within the tradition of manuscript painting, you see that there's a certain eroticness that is that has nothing necessarily to do with gender, but it has everything to do with touch and a language and intimacy, gesture, slowing down of space, kind of subliminal beauty, and how do you contain it? How do you understand it? Like for me, that's really what I kind of take from it when I'm looking at it, when I study it. I'm like, I want to get at it, and that's what you see in a lot of this work, is this kind of playfulness where, even in those paintings, like Who's Veiled Anyways, it's the motif is it's not necessarily a feminine form, but if you take a magnifying glass, it's very androgynous. It's often like it's the male under the white line, but you can't really tell.
Right.
So this for me, it had to do with, a lot of it was to push back at the way I felt I was the representation of Muslim women being boxed in it, like that it's just so removed from nuance. So that was my way of pushing back, was to really embrace all aspects of that idea, and that's what you see in a lot of the language that's happening in this work here. Is that the female is very prevalent, but then it's not one way of engaging with the feminine agency. It's many ways, and it's flirtatious, but it's also witty, and I think wit plays a very, for me it's very important. Like through humor I can kind of push boundaries, especially boundaries that art historical boundaries, which unnecessarily place everything in a very specific kind of binary role. That's just one layer. But that level of intimacy that, like when you look at Julie's paintings, it's also like, it's the way color and gesture and language just kind of come at each other, the way they come at each other through different sort of, and cast new relationships. They're always kind of cyclical and moving. Like I find like a lot of familiarity with that, with the way the intimacy of drawing, like drawing itself. Like if you think of gender, like how do you attach gender to drawing?
Yeah.
Like that kind of like finding forms and languages that defy the kind of expected role of gender.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, or that give space for a different kind of liberation. Like I think fundamentally that kind of pigeonholing or the kind of categorization or the binary, as you call it, becomes this very limiting way of understanding or making and creating ways of like determining ways of behavior or the kind of social constructs we're kind of like determined by or become these kind of societal norms. And I think so much about like queer being is about kind of liberating oneself in this space of like the kind of known reality of this other way of engaging with each other. And that's this kind of really deep known experiential truth in a way. Like you could think of John Coltrane, and you can think that that's what John Coltrane was also doing in terms of this kind of internationalist engagement and one of his kind of intense desires to go into deep Buddhist studies, or Alice Coltrane in the same way, to try and find this kind of, I guess at that time it was really about this universalist language, but you could almost think of that as this also this kind of queer optic in that time. Like there's this insistence on, and despite every kind of societal deterministic rule about the kind of unhumanness of this being, that there was this kind of invention in music and in creativity that went on to this other form of like language and expression and possibility. And I think it's in that place of possibility that lives outside of any kind of normative, kind of deterministic structures that allow for a different form of creative work to kind of emerge. And I think that's when you talk about pushing back, right? Like this pushing back is really is a knowledge. It's not even, it is not possible to cage someone in, you know? And I think I think about that. I'm thinking about that a lot, about these ideas of like, it's one of the reasons I go to Opacity and find Opacity as this liberatory space, because, and one of the reasons I think abstraction for me has been so much, even though there's this kind of constant, even though I don't necessarily kind of abide by or agree with the kind of idea around the abstract and figurative binary as well. Like within all the abstraction, there are these aspects of like the embodied in it. And then within all of this work, there's you could call this the most figurative work in a way, but it's completely, there are all these abstract kind of elements that are coming together in that way of cosmos or world building, or what you maybe call the queer optics or whatever. So to me, I think fundamentally in all of that, it's this form of mining liberation and like finding a place of, existing and being able to invent and insist on this kind of space where something else is possible that is not kind of defined by
the here and now.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's what's so, moving about both of your works, but, thinking, Julie, about, say, the Magama series, the ways in which, even within that space of destruction, even within that space of chaos and disorder and ruin, you find these openings, right? These possibilities, these lines of flight, And to me, that's very much a queer project, is insisting on the alternative, despite everything, in the most locked down place, right? So,
and it's a super, like, I think like a lot of other countries really, like, I think about queerness and queer kind of projects, and if you think about that, like in the East African or West African context, there's this very kind of openness about what is, who's queer, whether it's a kind of, sex worker through to
Exactly.
transgender being, like all of the street that can be safe for all of those are the streets that are safe for queer, and that
Right.
queerness becomes this very the net of queerness. Say that?
Capacious.
Yeah, capacious, and exactly, kind of space. And I think that that's something that is really kind of essential in like liberation thought right now, like because there's so much space for entanglement in liberatory thinking, and I feel like a lot of liberatory thoughts are compartmentalized more and more in particular movements in this country. And I think that at least right now it feels there feels like these kind of categorized spaces for that. There's either like Black liberation or like Black Lives Matter, and there's also this deep entanglement within all of that. But the more that entanglement can be understood, when you think about decarceration or kind of abolitionist projects within the prison, the kind of prison industrial complex, or whatever you want, however you want to think about that. Fundamentally, to be able to insist, I was just watching that Steve McQueen piece, a Small Axe piece on Alex Wheatley, and it was like, it was in prison that he learned this language, right? Like and I'm not talking that being imprisoned is necessary. I'm saying we are all in those kind of societal structures in one way or another, and that this kind of space of mining liberation and trying to like find that space to think of like incarcerated people or enslaved people as being these, as having to insist on their humanity, insist on this other place of flight. How do you mine that? How do you find that? And to me, that's like deep in the creative impulse, like of where we're working from. And I think it was really interesting to hear you talk about the sculpture and the making of that, in the mining of that space through kind of rethinking through these archetypes, or readdressing and reimagining how these archetypes can
also
exist.
And removing the center of sovereignty.
That's right.
Like a lot of my work kind of just dismisses it, and there's that type of intentional destabilizing that's happening at that level too, where I don't want any notion of the sovereign. And then oftentimes the feminine emerges and is either part of that flux or is open-ended, like how. But the feminine is very present there. But usually I will, even when I'm looking at, what are some of the motives that represent that idea of authority or sovereignty, and like how can I displace them in creative, funny, charged ways. So there's then of course then you're kind of playing with a non-fixed notion of representation, of identity, but also of politics. And of course then art history too becomes very open. So things can cross across different registers of time. So that ethos is very present, I think, in all the way I make a painting. And I often think like each work for me is that's how I call it, like it's a poem. It's going to every individual work has this play with power and powerlessness, and what are the dynamics of that in each particular work.
Absolutely. I mean, thinking about what you said about removing the sovereign, removing the Krishna from the center of the frame, right? And so what happens is that the margins sort of crowd into the center. And so with your animation, right, the sovereign disappears, and then the gopi hair, the gopis actually, they become disembodied, right? And then it's just the gopi hair that then becomes something else. It's not even woman anymore. And that's, I think, what I was gesturing to in relation to your work, really exploding gender itself, right? I mean, there is no fixed woman in your work. It is it is fragmented, it's decapitated, it's multi-limbed.
Or
it's
headless.
Headless, it's all of those things.
Yeah.
Or it's simply these marks. They become these marks,
Yeah.
right, and these gestures. So there's a kind of disembodied quality to gender itself, right?
True. And then at the same time, you can trace it back. Like if you took that idea of the particle system, right? And then if you wanted to, you will trace its DNA right to the hair silhouette.
Right.
Of,
Right.
of some representation in one historical painting. Like it'll map itself right to that detail.
Well, I mean, it strikes me that, the way, Shahzia, you use the kind of lexicon that you've kind of blown up for us behind us, the marks, right? I mean, it's kind of similar to the way you talk about marks in your work, right? That they are personages, they have their own agency, right? I mean, it seems quite similar in some ways to how, these become sort of flocks of starlings, in formation in some ways, right? So,
And also,
I
think like developing this relationship that is, that's not just going to sit between what is representational and what is abstraction, right? Like taking a lot more freedom in defining either or. So that, I think that's something that's constantly happening in the work, where even when things can be incredibly stylized and developed with a very sort of methodical manner, but then I will come in and I can like erase it, or I can disrupt it, or in that same sort of style, as if like I'm kind of using like a graffiti, the mark.
Yeah.
And so what happens at that moment in the work is that it creates like a tension in the surface, but I'm choosing to, kind of remove that notion of labor too.
Yeah.
And so so that kind of additive labor and subtractive labor, that's something also that was very prevalent in some of this earlier work, where it was happening through gesture and kind of creating, removing the inherent preciousness,
Right.
or a certain code or a language that you're supposed to adhere to, or is expected within the tradition or within the language or within its continuation.
Right.
So how do you? That's another destabilization that's happening.
Absolutely. So, to go back to the question of opacity that Julie raised earlier, it seems to me that both of you play with the sort of slippage between opacity and transparency in your work. And so, Julie, obviously Glissant's notion of opacity is really central to you, and you mentioned it earlier, in terms of that's also a kind of queer gesture in your work, a kind of refusal of knowability, right? The refusal to be fixed, to be transparent, and of course the demand, the injunction to be known is the demand that is placed on minoritarian subjects. That is a precondition of their control and surveillance. So I see you, deploying that language of abstraction very clearly sort of against that injunction.
Yeah, and this and in that kind of, so if you can talk about the right to opacity, you can talk about the right to abstraction too, for that same reason. And I think it comes from that same desire, that place of wanting to be able to engage, one, not to be surveilled and not to be determined, and to work against and mine others' possibilities. But there is this aspect of like what can be imagined in the unknowable, and I think that it's not something that I'm just saying. It's actually the way that I make, so that it's fundamental to creating this. The work comes from a place of a knowledge of materiality and a knowledge of mark making, and nothing is made in this vacuum. But in order to really invent something else in each piece, there's this place of there's a place I have to get to where I can actually be lost in and disembodied in the place of making, where like the intuitive sense becomes really important, and in that there's a freedom of kind of experimentation and play and serendipity and interesting kind of collisions. And you were talking about right now with erasure or this kind of rupture, and so much of that can be, you can think through that and understand it very differently. But the reality of making is one that's really different from thinking about it, putting language to it. And a lot of times you can't put language to what has been made, or what becomes this kind of visceral experience in front of a painting or in front of a drawing or in front of a sculpture. And that that experience becomes a very kind of, just a very felt and time-based visceral experience that can be transformative. So that is what I think is that, to be able to invent that in a moment where almost every mark has been made and almost every gesture has, how do you find the breaks in that, and to kind of invent something else, and what are the limitless possibilities in those spaces, and then how are those kind of, for me, those are it's within there that something else can really emerge. And I think we were talking about this earlier, that's one of the reasons I'm so interested right now in the blur, in the kind of the way that the blur is something that cannot be defined, that your eye cannot even focus on what you're seeing. So the image is illegible in that way. But then from within that illegibility, there's this kind of emergent dynamic that exists that creates the kind of emotive or transformative kind of experience that one can have with the work. And that emergence, whatever that emergent experience becomes, it's the potency in that I'm most interested in. And what I love about thinking around opacity and being able is that it goes to what you were talking about earlier in terms of, or relates to what you were talking about earlier in terms of being defined by cultural codes and being pigeonholed in terms of identity and who one is. And that there's this kind of expectation of Black artists, there's this expectation of artists from different places, there's expectation a lot of of women artists to kind of define who they are, and that that is not an expectation of most white men. Historically in this, that there's this freedom of making and freedom of space of any form of expression that can be part, or creativity that can be inventive in and of itself. And in the modernist moment, you had this real kind of drive towards, really particular, like this language as if it could be only self-referential. Like painting could only refer to itself and be made, and you would move into like minimalist kind of aesthetic. And I think, I've mentioned this before about David Hammonds, but I think David Hammonds is a really interesting artist who uses that language to flip that conceit on its head. That there's no way to think of a decultured zone of making. There's no way to think of this experience as being something that it can only exist within itself and refer to itself and have a certain kind of pure place of being. I think that, and yet that could only exist for a particular kind of practitioner is also bizarre. And so I think that for me, the insistence on abstraction is an insistence on that illegibility and not being defined and not being, not being able, not having, and that's some of the interesting criticism around my exhibition comes from exactly that. How do you deal with politics and abstraction together? To me, that's the headache. That's where you want to exist, or where one wants to exist. And I think that's really what you're talking about as well in terms of these kind of complex kind of images and ways of, when you talk about the edges coming into the center.
Absolutely. But what you were saying, about sort of pushing against these ideas of Muslim womanhood and all of those things, that to me is you taking on glissant as well and sort of refusing that sort of knowability of the gendered, racialized subject, that is sort of placed on you, on your being, in fact. And so, if you think of a piece like Choli Ke Piche, right, which the title itself, for those of you who may not know, it's from a Bollywood film from the 90s, right? from a song, right, from the 90s, and it translates as what's under your blouse, right? What's under your scarf, right? And so it's literally a kind of teasing sort of sexual sort of come on, that's supposed to be about revealing what's under the blouse. And then in your piece, what is under the blouse or what is under the skirt is this monstrous non-woman. It's like thinking about wit. I mean, that's the joke is actually on precisely that will to know and the will to see, that you are actually also consistently sort of frustrating in your work, just as Julie is, even though you're working with a different language, right?
Yeah. No, I think absolutely. I wanted to point out that in terms of working in a different language, that needs to be kind of deconstructed further. Mm-hmm. Like that this language is the other in the Eurocentric kind of in the archives of Eurocentricity. Mm-hmm. That's what defines this as the other language. Mm-hmm. So I'm taking on all of that baggage as well. Right. I chose to work in this language not because growing up in Pakistan, that's the language that everybody is working in.
Right, of course.
But it is a language that has gone through that whole legacy of colonial legacy and the inherent violence in being dismembered and scattered and sold for profit, and it's like it exists across different storages and different institutions. So when you're talking about a form which in people's imagination is that's culturally specific to somebody else, that premise is at fault.
Absolutely.
And I had a choice. I was like, either I'm going to struggle with this and the price you pay, or you're going to kind of keep pushing intellectually, conceptually this language and working within it what all that means. And not just like I'm using this language to show like contemporary stories. That's not what's happening here either. There's a different type of deconstruction, a different type of responsibility, which is the nature of colonial histories. It is truncated. It is how do you connect the dots? So much of it is in the archives, and if the archives haven't been archived, it's invisible.
Right.
So there's that too happening all the time, that it leaves that space to find new ways of narratives, to find new interpretations, to bring it right into the forefront. So it's very political in nature, as well as it inherently carries a legacy of violence.
Absolutely.
And so when you think of that, you cannot think outside of the militarism. You cannot think outside of the wars. You cannot think outside of patriarchy. You cannot think outside of racial violences also.
Right.
So all of it it just becomes that kind of world making and kind of an engagement with language, which is abstract in that respect. It's specific, but it's abstract.
Right. So I don't think I can sort of not ask you this question, because it's such an obvious sort of seemingly disjuncture between your works, which is the question of scale, right, and monumentality. And you both take on, as you just mentioned, these huge sort of world historical phenomenon from colonialism, nationalisms, revolution, war, militarism, but you do it with these very different languages and through these very different scales. But you both also play with scale in your work, right? We've talked about the minutia of your mark, Julie, and then the sort of large scale works that you create out of it. And then, of course, Shahzia, you've experimented with scale throughout your career. You're known for the small and the kind of jewel-like miniatures, but then, of course, you've also gone big, as we see behind us, and in your animations and in your floor-to-ceiling works. So I guess I wanted to just ask each of you, how you see scale, the play with scale functioning within your work as you take on these sort of really large sort of conceptual sort of questions, right? Julie?
Well, I think for me, like those large conceptual questions, I mean, just listing, hearing you both list them, are the conditions that we are made in, and that we question, like that we resist, and have really been deliberate, or not even deliberate, but we are kind of like, we don't have a choice in like the engagement with these issues in a particular way. But I think for me, the kind of questions of scale, things started really small, and the scale became really about how the body interacts with the work, and aspects of legibility, like how one can walk up to a painting and look at it on these very intimate levels, and then the painting fractures into 100 paintings or 20, thousands of paintings, and then from when you pull away, it's almost hard to remember all of those experiences, but it becomes a very different image from this other perspective. I think in my newer work, it's much more that feeling of being immersed in it, as you are when you're up close to it, happens from a distance with the bigger paintings, and that's a kind of intentional move into that space where the experiential kind of dynamic of the paintings are in that kind of all-encompassing kind of where the painting kind of envelops you in that way is part of the interest. But I think that they relate to our engagement with, like for me, it relates to my engagement with these same issues. And how does one locate and find oneself and find that mind for that liberation within the social construct we're made in, but also within the aspect of making. How can within painting one find freedom, and so and make as freely as possible. Like I think that's within that space. There's something else that can. There's a different kind of potency that can happen, and it's kind of when you can arrive at making something that's unexpected, and or unknown, or that you feel you haven't seen before, and that's like. You know what I'm talking about when you're actually in the space of making that,
Absolutely.
and that's when you arrive there. It's such the dragon one chases. Like whenever the reason you keep making is to kind of have that experience again. Can you get there? And how do you get there when the ground falls out under you? And I think that, so for me, that's one of the reasons that scale was ever an issue. Right now I'm working on smaller paintings, and it's really interesting how little, like how uncomfortable it is to work in this small scale because of the scale of my marks right now. But that early work, like I couldn't be doing the work I'm doing now if I had not made all that earlier work. And where the marks were really, this kind of small scale of the marks were part of the way that I could decodify and kind of invent new signifiers and invent new language that could then give me the freedom to work with the language I'm working in now that feels so much more referential to gestural abstraction or the history of like abstraction. But I think of the way that I'm working with it as kind of playing with these inventions of new neologisms, like new visual neologisms that kind of invent language from all of this language that has been made, but reconstructing it in a way to kind of deal with a new situation at hand.
Right.
No, it's so interesting because my world is small, right? And when I'm making like a very detailed, small gestural work, it's unexpected. It's not like a mapped out ahead of time. I'm working primarily with ink. You can't control ink. So when I'm thinking, as you were saying, Julie, I was like, how I see, past this exhibition, what started to happen was that I started to scan every sort of movement in that work at very high resolution, and eventually kind of realized that if I was expanding it to 30 feet or 40 or 70, what would happen would be that what was not visible to the naked eye would become in kind of a form that would, like a ghost, would emerge. And then that type of cartography that started to become possible was already in the work, was in the drawing, except that it was not visible to me. And I ran with that, and I think that's what parallax a lot of these kind of very large in the sense that you can watch them on your computer as well. So it's not large and large, but it has the potential to keep opening itself up like a very infinite space. So so in my practice, because I'm making those drawings myself, I found a place where I could kind of like an accordion or like an infinite kind of nature, like even in the composite nature of some of the schools that I'm referencing, where one unit can lead into an infinite kind of gathering. That, and then when you start adding score and you start adding music and language, then it becomes, it engages the visceral experience in a very different way too. So that relationship to language and gesture and mark and the possibility, like if I think of it, I'm like, if I go and look at the Shahnameh, for example, and I took a magnifying glass, there are like hundreds of faces embedded in the rocks, and you wouldn't even know, you can't see them. But if you have that, if you had now, if you have that type of access where you can put that amazing work under a magnifying glass or a microscope, and then you start seeing. So I wonder, like, why were they doing it that way, right? It really is. So like there's an entire chorus of faces that are singing to me from that landscape. They actually are in there, embedded in there. So I was like, okay, here, I that's not what's informing mine. Mine is also just connected to my own trajectory, to my own sort of history of making, but pushing and constantly pushing. So the scale in that way is almost like, it's encapsulated even in the small space. And it's possible. Absolutely. It can unfold like this. Because it's always there.
Well, I mean, I think that gets to the question of monumentality, because what you're saying is, what looks like these small spaces are actually monumental, right? Like the monumentality is sort of embedded within the miniature, right?
Yeah, that I think that it is. It was always about capturing like like something which was philosophically grand. Something that was, that encompassed the poet, the author, the time, the social, the politics. Even like when you see something, in the Sufi paintings and it looks like the dragon, it's also the mental state. It's not literal, but oftentimes some of the language was being used was very incredibly descriptive about some of this artwork. But you talked about monumentality, and I wanted to say that, in the work like this, and in terms of how to break outside of the perception of the preciousness, that's where the desire to declare an anti-monumentality was like, it's not literal in terms of the scale and the space, but the idea of like, when you project that, okay, this is so precious, you're you're putting it into a category, into a silo, into a fossilizing that, and that's where, coming back to like a non-binary space, pushing back on the gender, pushing back on these categories. That is what the anti-monument in my work is.
Right.
That it's not literal, but that it kind of pushes back at these kind of categories that limit it, the limit kind of. And I think that's where you cannot talk of the manuscript painting in these kind of terms which situated into labor and a preciousness, where for me, they speak languages that are, beyond all of it.
Right. So, Julie, thinking about that question of monumentality, I mean, everyone who writes about your work uses that term, right? It's monumental. I've used that as well, and but you actually very explicitly sort of study the monument, whether the monument is the stadia or the amphitheater, the plaza, the square, right? In order to deconstruct it. And so these spaces are both spaces of the demos, but they are also slide very easily into spaces of authoritarianism and fascism. And you seem to be sort of reflecting that in, say, the Stadia series or the Magama series. So you're doing something very specific with the monument, right?
Yeah, and also with the kind of gestures that we take happening in that space.
Yeah.
So like if it's, the square or the public square and the gesture of uprising, what we're seeing, witnessing in Cuba right now, what we saw in Hong Kong, and these kinds of what we used, at that time with those paintings, Tahrir Square, as well as many other places. There's that liminal space of kind of infectious possibility that's inherent in that, but it also plays like right between those places of being this place for the demos or the authoritarian. Like things could either get really worse in Cuba or like what is it that will replace? I mean, this is something that's just a struggle in Ethiopia right now, and so there's this place where we have this romantic idea of these big gestures, these enormous social gestures, and they're important. Like we witnessed it last summer here in this country with the kind of massive uprisings after the George Floyd murder, and I think when you see, or execution, or however you want to relate to that, but when you see this kind of contagious, infectious kind of social gesture and this real sense of almost like intoxicating liberation in the streets, and experiencing that moment, and then you realize how quickly that gets co-opted. I mean, one experiences that, and we've seen this repeated, these kind of repeat gestures, repeat actions, and
absolutely,
and the kind of complete co-option, or the kind of we think there's many moments that feel like we're in the midst of a form of reconstruction, but we're witnessing that reconstruction completely being eroded in different ways and being co-opted or in a very kind of explicit way in this kind of, what is the right calling it now? What is it called? It's in the news constantly.
That the right calls.
What is it? Like, what is it?
Oh, you mean critical race theory?
Yeah, critical race theory. They kind of like work against critical race theory. What is it called? Like critical race theory, right?
Yeah.
They're called, and it's on Fox News every other day. Like the kind of anti-white gesture, and you've seen this kind of complete co-option of this gesture within 5 years. Yeah. And you think about this from the early 90s, in the art world at least, you saw really intense projects of post-identitarian, or like idea of like of course, multicultural kind of discourse, post-AIDS, post-ACT UP, and you saw this kind of real openness in the art world. The 93 biennial was like a revolution in many ways. And completely by the mid-90s, by the time it was back to these ideas around aesthetics, and Dave Hickey wrote air guitar, and it was the kind of removal or erasure of that. Or not even erasure, kind of like,
re-entrenchment.
And kind of a re-entrenchment, but also an effort to kind of almost disempower
Totally.
those previous gestures, and you were witnessing it happening right
Absolutely.
now, just in this country. But so to me,
Yeah.
that kind of contradiction, that inherent contradiction that exists in those spaces, is and our social kind of efforts. Like real work happens slowly. The real kind of transformation happens in these places, and there are tipping points, and there are those collective huge, but that daily grind of that work is where you see those transformations existing. But we as agents love this kind of like, and there's something about that monumental gesture that we're all engaged with, whether it's spectacle or whether it's revolution or whether it feels like and so for me that's a place of like questioning, and a place that the work plays with, like, and in terms of experience, but also, you know, and one of the reasons I think drawing or intimate drawing is something that I'm also so interested in, because it's the complete opposite of that. It plays a very different role when you look at very intimate drawings, or when I feel like these are monumental, even though they're miniatures. They're these mega worlds. But there's something about what happens when you just look at one of the drawings with one of the gestures or one of the figures or these kind of, you know, that it becomes, or when you look at these and it's just a part of it, that it's a very different kind of experience, and it becomes something else completely. And I'm interested in that.
Because it's about the small act.
Yeah.
Right? And the small act is actually the place where change happens.
Exactly.
You know, rather than the massive revolution, which, as you're saying, always gets co-opted and always sort of reverts, right?
And not that those aren't important, because they are, and they have been historically.
Yeah.
But that's one of the reasons I think I keep thinking about Lil Nas X as we're all talking, as the most like liberative, like free person right now. Like I'm so amazed by him or them or and how they can be in terms of like embracing all forms of lives that matter. And really, like, you know, from I think
I love that.
Yeah. So Lil Nas X.
I think that may be a good place to end. Thinking about like queer possibility, right?
With the pink Mozart wig.
So thank you both so much. This was I have so many more things we can talk about, but we're out of our time. So thank you both so much for this conversation.
Thank you for the insightful questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.